Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webcast, Where Healthcare Payers and Providers Are Headed, How IT Vendors Can Capture Opportunity, highlighting the results from our recent Healthcare SourceIT study. My name is Allison Crawford, Senior Marketing Manager here at TBR, and I will be your host for today's session. Technology Business Research's focus is to provide business research to accelerate our clients' success, and this webinar is a part of these ongoing efforts to find new ways to support you and your business, helping you get the most out of your research investment. In TBR's new research program, SourceIT, we help our clients identify opportunity by highlighting the business and IT strategy drivers and demands in specific market segments, target IT purchasing decision makers by explaining purchasing scenarios, and identifying where in the business or IT organizations decisions to purchase will be made. This insight will help clients understand how changing customer dynamics, technology, and business models are influencing healthcare payers and providers, and how they are responding by investing in scaling out operations and business process improvements. Through this research, our goal is consistent: to provide actionable insight into the market and competitive strategies that translates into advantage for our clients. In the next 45 minutes, Senior Analyst Alan Kranz will delve into the trends driving the results featured in this recently released study, followed by Q&A of these trends and how they will affect you. Before I pass this over to Alan, there are a few logistics I'd like to cover. First, we'll be recording today's session and posting it on our YouTube site, TBRI channel. We encourage you to visit this channel to watch this presentation or any of the others we've posted. Second, we'd like to hear your opinions and thoughts on the materials we're presenting. Please send any questions or comments to the Q&A or chat function. We'll address them at the end of the presentation. Or you can request an inquiry call if you have additional questions. Third, we'll send out the slides to everyone registered for today's webcast within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. You can also find these slides, as well as other thought leadership pieces, webinar decks, and commentaries on SlideShare at www.slideshare.net/TBR_market_insight. And I'll share all these social media links with everyone at the end of the presentation. Now let me introduce Alan Kranz and Joe Wallen. Alan has been instrumental in the development analysis of the SourceIT research, and Joe is TBR's lead healthcare analyst who is on hand to answer any healthcare-specific questions you may have. Their presentation today is a summary of the key points found in the full 100-plus page report, which double-clicks into workload categories to specific key workloads, key project case studies, and deeper buyer analysis. And with that, let me hand this over to Alan.
Great. Thanks, Allison. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. So today we'll take a look at some of the insights that came out of our recent SourceIT healthcare report and really start to understand both the landscape from the customer side and their purchasing behavior, as well as some of the views into the vendors and the workloads that they're going forward investing in over the next year. So as we look at this space, and we've completed this research across multiple different verticals, in healthcare more than any other vertical that we've looked at, we see this tight marriage of the regulatory and compliance environment and the business objectives that these organizations are working towards and focusing on, so that in the end, when we look at the IT investment strategy and how that's being played out, really, a lot of times it's very difficult to separate the regulatory environment from their actual business initiatives. Most times they're tied very tightly together and married in terms of the outcomes and the benefits that are received from those. So if we look at the overall environment, the three dynamics that we see having the biggest impact on this space over the next year, it starts with the regulatory environment that's driving a lot of the investments that we saw. But it also comes down to trends that go far beyond just healthcare, things like big data, analytics, a big effort and a big desire among customers we spoke with as part of this to really mature their use of the data that's being driven, whether it's from intelligent devices, through compliance or regulatory initiatives. The growth in data in healthcare particularly has accelerated tremendously, and so we see this desire and need for the IT tools and processes that really allows them to not only take advantage of it for compliance reasons, but also for quality of care and business reasons as well. So similar to the regulatory environment, wrapping around this, we did see constrained budgets in healthcare, not unlike a lot of the other verticals that we looked at. However, there are pockets of growth, both in terms of the workloads that we see being invested in, as well as the differences between organizations. Size is one difference where we saw changes in terms of the overall size and trajectory of the budget, but there are others on the payer and provider side that speak to differences in their competitive environment, their funding sources, and ultimately the differences in the spending and the change in that spending. The quote in the overall market size I think is important as we step into this to understand, have some real-life example of some of the regulations that are being called out, as well as if you look at some of the comments around the funding, we did cover the public side of healthcare as well, looking at some VA spending and the Medicare, Medicaid side as well. When we look at the overall size of the addressable opportunity in large North American healthcare organizations, that includes both the payers and providers, we see a $26.3 billion opportunity in 2014. Now that's the vendor addressable spend. You'll see this as we go throughout the presentation, but we're honing our analysis around those areas from an IT vendor standpoint that are actually addressable. So it's not the overhead, the labor expenses. It really is those areas that are outside resources, solutions, and services that from an IT vendor, those are areas of opportunity within the large North American segment. So with that backdrop for the overall environment, we're going to focus on three major trends throughout today's presentation. The first will be to highlight some of the background for the IT investment. What are the drivers that came up during the research so that from a vendor standpoint, there's that common baseline and ability to speak the language, so to say, for the organizations within that space. Secondly is looking more deeply at those areas of investment, looking at the pockets of growth, what the priorities are, both from a solution standpoint and from a software workload standpoint, so that the growing areas, the largest areas are identified, and the ability is there to go out and specifically target them. Thirdly is taking a deeper look at not what they're spending on, but what does the process look like for making decisions for IT solutions, and what are the differences in customer persona within this vertical? Because we did see a real segmentation based on the behavior, the decision making, and the size of the budget that play into the overall environment that we see for healthcare. So with that, let's get started. So when we look at the need for healthcare solutions and services, we really do see a marriage of capabilities that are required from a customer standpoint. So if we look at this quote, it really sums up a lot of the feedback that we received throughout. It hits on a number of different topics. First of all, if we look at the specific call out of ICD-10, that it's not necessarily just a project, but it's a program. It's a series of investments made over time with milestones laid out. So it's not just a one-year budgetary item. It really does extend out over time, and we saw that with a lot of the behavior and the budgeting activity that it really is a programmatic view, not only for the compliance standpoint, but also for those follow-on projects. A lot of times we saw piggybacking. A lot of the initial investment is made due to compliance reasons, but then there are other benefits that can come out of that, some of which require additional investment, but that is really viewed as an end-to-end program. Second part of the quote that's important is the focus on the consultant contributions. So this is important not just from an outside labor perspective. We do see heavy use of services for that expertise. Certifications are critical, but more generally looking at both solutions and services, the advantage for having that healthcare expertise and how that plays into decision making in this space. Because we see big differences in terms of the business-focused workloads or the patient-focused workloads, really centering or favoring companies that bring a healthcare focus to the table, and then a lot of the more horizontal IT workloads where the mainstream IT vendors really have a more open playing field, more of an advantage to be able to come in and leverage their horizontal capabilities, but not as distinct capabilities within the healthcare segment. So those are some of the baseline things as we step into what we see from an environment perspective. So here we've laid out, starting at the left, what are the external forces that came up again and again in terms of the environment that these organizations are working within. So starting there, obviously the regulatory wraps around and is ever present for these organizations. We did see more and more focus on the growth of electronic healthcare data. So this takes many forms. Part of it is related to pure compliance. If you look at something like ICD-10 and the initiatives that are involved not only to meet that benchmark, but also to take advantage of the standardization of data that comes as a result of that. So we see, really a focus today on meeting the compliance, but the expectation that there will be follow-on investments on the backside of that as well. As well as we have consolidation of back office systems. So we've seen that, we see outside of healthcare, a big push has been made in a lot of verticals to consolidate, to simplify, to centralize the management and storage of a lot of IT resources. And so we're seeing a little bit earlier stages of that same type of consolidation within the healthcare space. And so that's reflected not only in the qualitative comments, but also in the budgeting. We've seen in terms of overhead, the expectation that that budget line item is actually going to decrease going forward on average for healthcare organizations. A lot of that will be driven by a consolidation of systems on the back end. Moving into what the healthcare organizations see and a little bit more distinct impact, partially as a result of these external forces, but also as a result of their internal initiatives. So we see lots of efforts to more extensively utilize data that's generated, to leverage technology for things like mobile and telemedicine. So part of these initiatives are internally focused on efficiency and effectiveness, but also we see a split where a fair amount of investment is also going to things that directly impact the patient experience. So being able to deliver healthcare services over distance and decrease things like travel time was something that from a provider perspective came up quite frequently. As well as an overall, so we talked a little bit about the consolidation, how they're at an earlier stage. From an IT perspective, we see a big focus on improving efficiency, process improvement. So again, it may be spurred by compliance, but these are all things on the back end in the IT department that are focal areas and really efforts that not only can play into the constrained budgets and decrease cost, but also get to an area where they're really improving IT as a competency within their organization. So if we look at how they're actually reacting, we've covered a lot of it, but a lot of it comes down to better use of data, improving the underlying IT infrastructure, and we'll see some interesting characteristics as we look at the priorities versus actual spending there, because we do see increased levels of expense. It may not be as prominent a focal area when you look at the priority of investments, but it is going to be a significant driver of the overall market opportunity for vendors in the space, as well as improving the bottom lines. And I think with a lot of the changes in the market that we've seen over the past year, this is becoming more and more of a focus, and really ties back through the efficiency both in terms of the delivery to patients, but also the IT side, focusing on cost savings, improving the bottom line, I think is a heavier weight as you look at their priorities So it comes up a number of times as we look at how the investments are laid out. So with that broader baseline, when we look at the areas of priority, so this is not necessarily the levels of spending across these categories. This is the percent mentioned for when we rolled up, presented this to people, what are the priorities for healthcare IT spending? And it really ran the gamut in terms of when we look at the discretionary spending, you can see the comment on the right. For some, and we saw this primarily among the larger organizations on average, that discretionary spending is very tight. This respondent said that it's almost non-existent. So for a lot of organizations, it is a difficult balancing act between maintaining existing investments, meeting new compliance and regulations, and then, once those baseline hurdles are met, the funds for discretionary can many times be fairly small. It limits the new initiatives that can be put in place. On the other side of the spectrum, we did talk to a number of organizations and saw this in terms of the overall growth of IT spending that are making new investments and expanding. So the comment doesn't necessarily speak to all organizations in this industry, but certainly was something that we saw come up. So within that discretionary environment, when we looked at the priorities for where investments, what's the pecking order in terms of what types of initiatives are going to be funded, the industry apps is really huge. So this plays into the desire for that healthcare focus. A lot of that drives the healthcare-specific investments. At nearly a quarter of the priority of investments, that's reflected very clearly. As well as if you look at the overall applications priorities, those really account for the majority of mentions. When we went out and sampled for that. So with that baseline, we'll go forward, but we'll draw back to that as we look at the actual spending levels. So when I talk about the differences in terms of the spending behavior, here we're illustrating the difference in size. So we looked at large healthcare organizations in North America. So we started at 1,000 employees as a baseline, went up to 10,000 plus, and then segmented the results in terms of their budget by those different size categories. So going on the top part is the feedback from those with 10,000 plus. You can see it roughly $23 million average budget for 2014, and that actually represents a decrease from 2013 spending. So contraction in spending on the overall for those large firms. Most of the growth for healthcare as a whole is being driven by the firms in the 1,000 to just below 10,000 employees. So we're looking at about a 3% average IT budget increase for them. So if you look at the average on total, it's about 13.2 for the respondents that we spoke with, and it reflects the categories that we've laid out below. So largely focusing on hitting on the software areas, but also including those things like overhead and infrastructure, which round out the overall investment in IT. So going a little bit deeper into so we've covered the budgetary areas. This is taking a step back up to that overall industry view. You'll notice the $26.3 billion from the front slide, that overall vendor addressable opportunity. But the way in which we got down to that level was to start with the overall. So that's the $34.8 billion. You'll see that includes things like personnel and overhead, accounting for about a quarter of that. So most of the analysis that we're going to go through really dives deeper into that vendor addressable spend. So when we looked at the key priorities, this is from a solution level. So it rolls up a lot of the investments that you saw earlier around BI analytics, industry applications. These are the things that are really driving the spend in those areas. So electronic health records remains a big driver of the overall investment that's vendor addressable. And then you'll also notice a lot of these external facing, a lot of them do in fact touch the patient experience. So we do see investments split between internal and external. For these key priorities, it's really summed up and driven by a focus on that end patient. On the back end side, when we look at from the IT perspective, what's actually going to support and enable those patient-facing workloads, we look at information management and databases, just huge areas of increase in focus in terms of the spend, really managing the data that's both required from a regulatory standpoint and created and can be used for other things, more intelligent decisions within the healthcare organization. So in terms of what vendors need to know on the right, really a lot of it is initially spurred by regulation, but there are those follow-on activities that can really drive significant ongoing spend and that are key areas of opportunity for vendors to target. Analytics and big data, we've got a much earlier stage, not just from this study. We've done separate studies looking exclusively at the adoption, the use of different tools within BI and analytics, and seen healthcare on the earlier end of the spectrum in many ways compared with other industries in terms of how they're actually using it to drive the business, not just to meet regulatory requirements, but to fine-tune the business strategy, improve efficiency. Those are all things that we see increasing going forward for organizations in the healthcare vertical. And we've hit on this a couple of times, but the vertical expertise, as you look at those key priorities, that level of certification and qualification is critically important as you look at those types of spending priorities and workloads. So that rounds out the environment, the background that we see. Next, we're going to go a little bit deeper into the specific areas of investment and how it plays out from a budgetary perspective and a market perspective as we look at the different areas of IT spending and workloads. So here we're segmenting that total opportunity, looking at the workloads themselves, and you can see, as we start to look at the left in the pie chart, that professional services plays a big role in terms of the overall solutioning in this area. It's a critical support element, as well as the applications. Now, the thing that I'll call out is, if you remember previously, the key priorities from a spending and investment perspective really focused on the application. So industry, business, productivity, those things that really reside in the hands of the decision makers, not necessarily the IT organization, were what people want to be investing in. If you flip forward and look at this chart, you can see that they're still there, there's still large areas of spend, but that the services required to really support those, the actualization and realization of those benefits from the applications is huge. The infrastructure is significant, and when you add in things like systems management and database and middleware, all of a sudden you have a majority of that actual spend going into areas that are really support functions, enable the ultimate solution, but it just speaks to the requirements really needed in order to achieve the benefits that these organizations are looking at. So that's a critical thing to understand, and also from a targeting perspective, although the focus may be on some of the systems management or infrastructure, tying it back to those higher level solutions and the priorities can really go a long way to moving forward with certain investments and tying back to the ultimate priorities for these organizations. So when we look at the change over time, we've hit upon this a little bit. We see a little bit of a shift in priority and budgeting from, you can see the decline in industry applications, probably the biggest area of change that we see from 2013 to 2014. And what that speaks to is the beginning of a transition from this as heavy a vertical focus to creating more opportunity for the horizontal IT workloads. And I think part of that is driven by their accelerating adoption of things like BI and analytics. So with that drives the requirement for more horizontal IT solutions that address the underlying data, provide all of the data quality and management aspects that are really required to ultimately deliver BI that can be used both for regulatory and for business decisions. So we see more of a shift to the sweet spot for mainstream IT vendors rather than as heavy an influence of the vertical-specific players that came up as we went out and spoke with folks. And so that's also reflected in things like the increase in infrastructure spending, professional services. All that ties into this broader evolution that we see occurring in the healthcare space. But overall, you can see the increase in average budget over that time frame, going up to the $13 million that we saw on average for respondents in 2014. So when we combine the views of the business workloads, the IT workloads, assign dollar values to them, look at the top-of-mind vendors, you can see just some of the comparisons between those things that are solution-focused, things like the EHR, telemedicine, really touch more of the patient and provider perspective. Smaller dollar values on average we saw for those budgets and priorities. When you pair that with the investments on the right, these are things that are more IT focused but that ultimately support that solution delivery. You can see the vendors change as well as the project budgets change. So the bigger budgets tie into that split that we saw between the infrastructure services and the actual applications, as well as a shift to the more mainstream IT vendors rather than those that focus exclusively on the healthcare space, as we see come up on the left-hand side with vendors like Epic, McKesson, Siemens, more of a healthcare focus for those vendors, which really makes them top of mind for the business-focused solutions. So when we look at how, so we've covered the size of the budgets, some of the vendors that are top of mind. When we talk with people about how they actually make decisions and what that process looks like, the common process that we saw was starting at the top with the overall, and then it very quickly goes into two different budgets. We saw this zero priority budget, which really are requirements. There was very little choice or decision made about that. The funds needed to be allocated, so it's almost viewed as a separate category. Still a lot of vendor addressable opportunity there, but it certainly is segmented in terms of how they're going through the overall budget process. So aside from the priority zero, we saw this discretionary budget, which on average was about 34% of the total. And then we saw that being connected to the roadmap and agenda going forward. And that was a combination of those internal-facing activities, analytics, the consolidation of data centers, that type of efficiency and process improvement activity, and those that are patient-facing that actually improve the quality of the experience for the providers and the people receiving the care. So within those patient-facing activities, a lot of the actual realization of them comes from piggybacking on things that are required by regulation, whether it's digitizing certain pieces of information and then using that to improve care, to sharing health records, to leveraging telemedicine and really tying it all together in a way that benefits them. That was a priority, did come up, but in all honesty, for a lot of the respondents, it was driven by other initiatives. So lastly, the last trend that we're going to look at takes a deeper view into the segmentation of the vendors, the customers in this space, their behavior, and how that actually plays out and impacts their spending. So in order to segment the customers here, and we've used this approach with the other verticals as well, we've developed a quadrant view that takes into account the centralization of their IT spending, so how many people are involved, how distributed is the responsibility for that, as well as their own self-reported aggressiveness for adopting new technologies, for continuing to invest and spend to improve either outward-facing or internal-facing activities. So developed a couple different quadrants here. And what we saw was a heavy concentration of and a correlation between the centralization of the IT spending and their actual aggressiveness in adopting new technology. So for those customers in the bureaucrat segment, about 42% of the respondents we spoke with, they're self-described late adopters of technology. A lot of it's driven by the regulatory compliance requirements. They're not as aggressive in terms of using things like BI analytics, and that the decisions are highly centralized for them. So that's 42% of the overall population. The larger category that we saw was customers that were both self-reported as aggressive, and with that decision and influence is really distributed throughout a wider segment of their organization. So more input from the departmental level, from the on the clinical side, more stakeholders involved in the evaluation and the prioritization. So there are differences in terms of how to approach and go through the purchasing cycle with them. So it really requires, from the vendor standpoint, an equal investment in terms of how to speak the language for these two groups of customers. Because when you boil it down, the size is fairly comparable, as well as the budgets. I mean, you look at the budgets, and they're extremely close in terms of their overall levels of spending. So the investment is there. It's just a matter of what types of priorities they have, and the degree of aggressiveness with which they're going to continue to move upon that roadmap and look for improvements. So that's also reflected as we look at how decisions are actually made. So this takes a little bit deeper view of the top level on the previous slide. You can see for the bureaucrats, most of the authority and the evaluation is made at the very highest levels of the organization. And the quote highlights that very well. So if you look at the board of directors being directly involved in the evaluation of different solutions, not just from a dollar perspective, but looking at the specifications of those projects, very tight control at the top of the organization. Whereas for a lot of the more aggressive and distributed customers in the empowered segment, we saw input being used, a lot of committees, a lot of input from the clinical sides, not just a compliance or a board-level decision. So there is this difference in terms of how the input is really, or who puts the input into the overall decision. It doesn't necessarily change. We still saw most decisions made at the C-level, at the highest parts of the organization. But the influence points certainly are different as you look at the two different camps of customers that we saw. So to kind of sum up and wrap up today's discussion, when we looked within the healthcare priorities, we saw this dual factors, both from a regulatory perspective and increasingly from a business perspective. Now, we see this something at much earlier stages than a lot of other industries that we look at, but we expected to follow a similar path in terms of shifting more of the investment to data-focused activities, tying that into business decisions, and with that, a tremendous amount of opportunity opens up, not just for the BI and analytics itself, but for the changes that it makes in terms of how the business is driven and how IT plays into that. So that instead of IT or business benefits coming in on the back of regulatory initiatives, we do expect to see more, as they build the experience, using IT more as a strategic tool for the business rather than think about that after compliance requirements that have been met. So we do see a shift, and certainly when you look at the priorities that are laid out, starting to see much more focus on and a melding between the business outcomes that are desired through things like industry applications, the business applications, BI, and the IT investments that are required on the back end to make that happen. So I think there's still a gap there. Look for a tightening of that going forward as their levels of investment continue to increase, particularly for that smaller segment of customers in the 1,000 to just under 10,000 employee range. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Allison to open it up for questions.
Great. Thanks, Alan, and thanks to those of you who have sent questions already. I just want to remind you guys that this is the research that we've covered right now are the high-level findings from a much deeper report that is available. The first question we had come through Alan and Joe. What about hardware such as desktops, notebooks, and tablets? What's the IT spending for them?
So that wasn't as large a focus area for our study, but we did cover that with a lot of the hardware infrastructure. It was included from a budgetary perspective. So what we've seen there is, relatively early stages of a transition from desktops to mobility to very much more limited use of tablets and that type of solution. I don't think that's unique in terms of the verticals that we look at. But I think in terms of the investment from a personal hardware perspective, we did see earlier stages overall, but I think it's following the same trend in terms of getting more towards the tablet and mobility side, and then into the mobile phone space. I just think that from certainly from a provider perspective, earlier stages there in terms of that transition. So although it wasn't a focus, that's the flavor that we picked up on during the discussions.
Okay. The next question that's come through. What are some of the key workloads that you see significant levels of investment in?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at the workloads that we saw significant investment in going forward, a lot of it ties back to the priorities that we saw. So from a solution perspective, we did see telemedicine came up again and again in terms of kind of a solution. It ties in a lot of workloads on the back end as well as some device investment in order to make that happen. So although it's not a standard desktop, laptop, those types of hardware solutions are a focal point as you get into things like telemedicine, which we saw come up, as well as broader initiatives around BI and analytics. Certainly an area where we saw a lot of interest. If you look at it compared with some of the applications investments, it's not as big. But when you tie in from a solution perspective, the back-end infrastructure, the data management, data warehousing, that's certainly becoming an increasing area of investment. So from a growth perspective, that was one that stuck out.
Okay, the next one that came through. Can you provide some more color on the role of professional services firms?
Yeah, absolutely. So from a professional services standpoint, we did see increased use within the healthcare vertical for services firms. So a greater reliance, and a lot of that comes down to, it came up in a number of the comments that you'll see throughout the deck, that for that expertise or for that compliance-related initiative. It's not necessarily a competency that they feel like they need to build internally, that for a lot of the services firms, that's a great area of strength and one that they can come in and provide on an ad hoc basis, but something that once the initiative is in place, those levels of spending can decrease, and they're going to be able to maintain it their own on the operational side.
Yeah, and Alan, if I could just quickly jump in, I think that you're also seeing a higher demand for the professional services from a staff augmentation standpoint, because what we're seeing in our survey and in view of the marketplace is that there is a distinct shortage of these healthcare-oriented IT services talent out there for, say, the providers and payers to bring in-house directly. So they are relying more and more on professional services organizations to give them that additional staff to meet these near-term requirements, such as ICD-10, and also, in many cases, getting any kind of health insurance exchange interface that's going to need to be up and running by October this year. So I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Looks like we have time for one more question. You say they are investing in cloud, but which architectures are they favoring? Are there differences by workload?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we looked at the, you've seen a lot of the workload-specific data, the budgeting. We've also gone on the back end and looked at what types of both hardware platforms as well as the broader deployment options that are available to customers for these workloads, so that we could understand not only what's going to be purchased, but what type of deployment method was preferred as you looked at all the different options. So within healthcare, what we saw was, yes, some differences across the different workloads, but again and again, looking at, as you look at things like traditional on-prem remains, one of, if not the largest focal point for how to deploy future workloads across most of these, across most of them. So that's fairly consistent. I think that speaks to some of the efforts that we saw in terms of consolidation of data centers. Continuing to invest in the traditional infrastructure is one that really reflects the reliance upon traditional on-prem from the majority of these workloads. In terms of cloud, what we saw there was some interest in public cloud, although during the interviews a lot of the security and the compliance concerns came up, particularly for sensitive data, wherever that's involved. So on the average, private cloud interest is probably 3 times the amount of public cloud. So that, and this ties into a lot of our findings in other cloud studies, that for certain workloads, and I think a lot of them in healthcare fall into this category, public cloud may not be an option for those, either in reality or just from a risk standpoint, that it's not the deployment method of choice for customers there, but that private cloud, both adoption and consideration, is set to pick up tremendously over the next 3 years, as both from a tool standpoint and a skills standpoint, these organizations build more competency to use a cloud delivery method, but do it in a way that either leverages third-party management from service providers, or that they're able to build on-premise and use some of the cloud building blocks that are available to do it in a way that still keeps that eye on the overall regulatory environment.
Okay, it looks like we have a couple more questions in queue, but we're out of time. So what I'd like to suggest is that we're going to follow up with those folks out there that have sent through questions we have not had a chance to answer them today. So the analysts will be reaching out to you directly to have those conversations. So to wrap up, I just want to make you guys all aware of some additional SourceIT webinars that we're doing. We've already recorded public sector and telecom, as well as retail in the wintertime, and we're going to be doing banking and financial services later this week. So if there's any interest either from you or anyone on your team to attend these webinars, you can look for those registrations at the same place where you register for today's webinar. As I mentioned, I was going to share with you all of the social media links, so you could follow Alan on Twitter as well as TBR on Twitter at the handle listed here, as well as follow us on SlideShare, YouTube, and LinkedIn at the URLs listed below. And we do encourage you guys to engage with us in conversations and ask our panelists any questions that you may have as your businesses evolve. We're going to leave the chat function open for a couple of minutes in case anyone has any last-minute questions they'd like follow-ups on, or any additional information about getting access to this research. As we did mention, this is just a high-level overview of the research that's part of this deliverable. So if you'd like to get access to that, please let us know. If we don't hear from you guys soon, you can look for the slide deck to be sent out for the next day, as well as a recording link that if you want to watch this presentation or share it with any of your colleagues, we'll be sending that as well. Thanks, everyone, for spending time with us today. Hope we answered a bunch of your questions, and we look forward to speaking with you all soon. Thanks.